I can see that the broadcast is live. Dzień dobry, nazywam się Magdalena Wieczorek. W imieniu Instytutu Językoznawstwa i Literaturoznawstwa chciałabym zaprosić na wykład pod tytułem H.G. Wells and the Imagination of the Future. Autorem wykładu jest Maxim Shadurski, który stopień doktora uzyskał na Uniwersytecie w Edynburgu w Szkocji. Jest autorem 3 monografii i około 50 innych publikacji naukowych dotyczących m.in. utopii. Jest redaktorem naczelnym międzynarodowego czasopisma naukowego The Wellesian, The Journal of the H.G. Wells Society oraz adiunktem w Instytucie Językoznawstwa i Literaturoznawstwa w Uniwersytecie Przyrodniczo-Humanistycznym w Siedlcach, gdzie prowadzi również zajęcia z literaturoznawstwa angielskiego obejmujące okres od XIX wieku do czasów współczesnych. Chciałabym przypomnieć, że wykład jest prowadzony w języku angielskim. Okay, Maxim, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be able to participate in this promotional enterprise run by our university. And I hope those who have decided to join me this morning and later on would find this lecture insightful, given its topic, H.G. Wells and the Imagination of the Future. I suppose each one of us here and then in life would ask that question, what the shape of things to come might be and how we may progress into the future. As societies, of course, we tend to ask that question even more often, especially in recent times such as ours with the pandemic, when that will be over. So those questions, in other words, are not new. And when preparing this lecture, I also was wondering what the best author to include in that discussion of the future might be. And of course, none other than H.G. Wells, because he happens to be, as most critics believe, the father of science fiction in English literature, the founder of science fiction in English literature. So today's lecture will take you through a number of points, as you see displayed here in the outline. First, I would make a distinction between prophecy and prediction, and we will find out that prediction is a somewhat different method by which Wells, unlike many of his predecessors, worked with the future. Then, in order to elaborate more on that difference, I would say a few words about Wells's background in science and his literary career, because that career, as you will find out, spans so many years and saw so many outputs. In this lecture, I would only like to focus on 9 of H.G. Wells's predictions. There can be a few more, and those 9 predictions will highlight how Wells was ahead of his time on so many occasions, how he would envisage things, developments, objects, or phenomena that would only later, decades later, come to pass. Of course, any discussion of predictions would be impossible without considering the drawbacks, the limitations of any such futurology or future imagination. So under the rubric of oversight, I will find out what Wells, as well as his contemporaries, got wrong. And that will leave us with a few concluding remarks towards the end of this lecture. And so let us start with prophecy and prediction and how these are different. Since times immemorial, humanity, people around the world, regardless where they were, wanted to know the shape of things to come. In the biblical tradition, prophets were the ones who mediated the future. They somehow derived that knowledge of the future from divine intervention, from God's words. They did so with the help of mystical insight and knowledge directly sent from God. There were also others, of course, various kinds of seers who claimed to know the future. They looked up to the stars or to their cards or to their coffee grounds for insight. There were also such who would call up the souls of the dead in order to find out more about what is yet to come, groups of spiritualists, as it were. However, in the late 19th century, an English writer changed completely the ways in which the future could be imagined. His name is Herbert George Wells, H.G. Wells for short. He lived between 1866 and 1946. And instead of prophecy and mystical insight, as well as divine intervention, he proposed practicing prediction as a scientific method. And there is very broad explanation why he chose to underpin prediction with a scientific method. Because he himself was, in the first place, trained as a scientist, as a biologist. He rose from the lower middle class, and therefore it was a major challenge for him to study for a degree at London University, not so much to study, but to be able to get across the threshold of a university as a person from a somewhat underprivileged background. And yet he achieved such heights that he was supervised in his education by none other than T.H. Huxley. T.H. Huxley, in his own time, in the late 19th century, was second in importance only to Charles Darwin. And as proponent of Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory, Huxley added an ethical dimension to evolutionary theory. It was to become not a theory of the survival of the fittest, but of the survival of the best. And so, in many important ways, Wells, as a student of T.H. Huxley, learned such principles of ethical evolution and began to apply them later on in his career as a writer. So Wells was quite confident that geological, biological, and evolutionary knowledge would be enough to imagine the future with accuracy. So here lies a major difference between a prophecy and prediction. Prophecy is based on insight, mystical, divine, or any other, whereas prediction rests on a deep knowledge of various fields, and as it were, at the end of the 19th century, prominence was given to geological science, to biology as such, and evolutionary processes. Wells's literary career spans 52 years. It was very long. Actually, he was so prolific, so productive, that he would put out several volumes every year in various genres. And those genres include, as I say, biological and scientific textbooks, realist novels, political journalism, short stories, an autobiography, a film script, utopias, dystopias, and a world history. Some of the more famous examples of his writing are displayed here in book covers. And you see from 1901, his book Anticipations, which I also used as a cover image for today's lecture. And that book, as critics have noted, starts of all things, not about birth, death, architecture, but about transport. So as though for Wells, moving forward into the future would be inseparable from traveling fast. And that will explain actually a number of his predictions I'm going to address during the rest of this lecture. Wells also, throughout his literary career, was a very highly traveled person. He went to Russia on 3 occasions, to the United States on many occasions, and you know, surprisingly, unlike many of his contemporaries from the Western part of the world, he was given access to world leaders, not only in the West, but also in the East. And that insight, that primary significant first-hand knowledge fed into his books, you know, journalism and novels as such. His most famous works, though, are scientific romances. He used this term scientific romances as self-conscious coinage, as a word that he invented for himself in order to describe the nature of fiction he was writing. Nowadays, of course, we all believe these are science fiction, and yet scientific romances is what he termed the books such as The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, The First Man in the Moon, In the Days of the Comet, The Sleeper Awakes. I'm pretty sure you either might have seen some of the screen adaptations based on these. You might have heard these books titles without thinking that they were written by H.G. Wells, or you might have read them indeed, or it would be ideal that you would want to read them after this lecture. In his science fiction, Wells made some of his most important historical and technological predictions. Of course, he went on to make his predictions elsewhere in other genres, but more often than not, his science fiction played that fertile ground for projections of the future. And now, I would like to start with the first of his predictions, which was that of time travel. Time travel, still remains a largely unachieved prediction. We know after Albert Einstein's theory of relativity that time can be experienced differently. And if we shoot ourselves or allow anyone to shoot us into space, we would be able to experience time differently than those who stay on the planet. So, partly in anticipation of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, H.G. Wells already was projecting a possibility of where time could be felt differently. But for Wells, that time would be felt differently because he took his main character into deep time, into geological time. If you look at the year 800 and 2701, it looks almost incredible. That's longer than perhaps human history, not perhaps, but most surely that's longer than human history. And yet, the time traveler, when he reached that year, he found out something rather unpleasant and rather dissatisfying. There he discovered a fading sun and no human life at all. And Wells made such a prediction in order to pose a warning to his contemporary readers and us nowadays, that indeed evolutionary theory shows that evolution prefers crab-like creatures to creatures standing upright. And so here, in one of his earlier fictions, Wells was already giving an instruction that unless humans unite and work together, they would not be able to overcome the march of evolution that leads ultimately to degeneration. The second prediction of Wells's is the technology of flight. In 1899, he published When the Sleeper Wakes, another scientific romance, where the main character flies above future London. Why was it important, even years before the first flight was operated, to show how flight was important? You know, Wells was a writer of such imaginative heights that through the technology of flight, he was showing that only from above could a person or a whole society acquire a better vision of social, economic problems, divisions that might be, and in this way scan the ground in order also to improve it later. The first flight in history took place only 10 years after Wells made his prediction, and that was in 1909 when Louis Blériot flew above the English Channel. Number 3, biological engineering. And this is quite recent in our history, in the sense that biological engineering acquired much attention in scientific circles, in ethical discussions only recently. And yet, already at the end of the 19th century, in his scientific romance, The Island of Dr. Moreau, from 1896, Wells portrayed a character who happened to be a vicious and evil scientist, not the kind of scientist we would like to see in our world, but a scientist who, for his own self-glorification, would take parts of human glands and insert them into animals in order to produce hybrids. His experiment was an experiment of power in the first place, where he would observe those newly created creatures becoming human and where he would rule over them. Nowadays, of course, there are so many regulatory bodies, and there is much discussion regarding the ethics of the biological or embryonic chimeras, as they are called. And yet, such experiments began in nature only in the 1950s. And most recently, a human peak chimera was created, and only a very tiny fraction of 1% of that chimera contains human cells. There is no space to go into that ethical discussion now, and yet this is where science has been working. And for Wells, writing at the end of the 19th century, his prediction was double-edged. On the one hand, he would promise that science might, conquer disease and create something radically new. But on the other hand, it was a sign of warning that indeed, degeneration would be very close in sight if such experiments go out of hand. Number 4, military lasers. In 1898, Wells published The War of the Worlds. This particular scientific romance has received so much attention in popular culture. It has been filmatized, there have been radio broadcasts, some of which quite scandalous. And yet, the main invention put forward in The War of the Worlds was the heat ray. The story goes that the Martians come to our planet because they've run out of natural resources on Mars. And they begin a campaign of complete destruction of humans with the help of the heat ray. So the heat ray actually condenses in itself not only light, but also so much energy that it obviously is able to evaporate humans. Military lasers, which such a heat ray anticipates, came into operation in the 1980s. Yet many projects concerning such equipment remain on hold. They are very difficult to achieve, and as I've checked online on some recent research, they hardly ever go beyond either flashlighting or blinding. So you see, that prediction remains unfulfilled and remains a warning that there might be so many potential dangers too. Number 5, the tank. In 1903, Wells wrote a short story called Land Ironclad, and that's precisely the name he gave a future tank. He did not use the word tank, but Land Ironclad, as we see in the image. And those were able to crawl on land and were completely unbeatable. The First World War made tanks a necessity because the First World War came to be the first mechanized war, and that mechanized war involved not only various types of machine guns and bombs, but more so the construction of trenches. And in order to navigate the land, to surpass all these obstacles in the form of trenches, tanks were put into operation. Number 6, very disturbingly here, the atomic bomb. In 1914, Wells wrote another science fiction, which was The World Set Free. And in that science fiction, Wells experimented along, very typical for himself, along the lines where he would destroy the old world completely in order for a new world to appear. Of course, nowadays, as back in the day, many people would find it extremely problematical and disturbing. Why would you need to bring down the whole world order in order for a new one to emerge? And this is what Wells liked to practice, to unleash his imagination of destruction in order to see a new planet reappearing. Historically, of course, we know something completely different about the first testings of the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb was first dropped on 2 occasions in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, and that happened in Japan on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, you know, with sad irony, those 2 bombs created much free ground for a new society to appear. But whether that cost of destruction is indeed the price to pay for a new society remains a big question. So here, Wells's prediction is more disturbing than promising, and whether, you know, its further fulfillment is a lesson to learn is for us to decide. Number 7 is the launch of spacecraft. You know, science, as Wells understood it and as we understand it nowadays, is not an evil force by itself. It's only that it may be put to evil uses. And therefore, even if we, from our own perspective, are beyond Wells this time, look at the history of science in the 20th and 21st century, we think immediately of medicine, but we also need to be thinking of space exploration, where science indeed would triumph with its new discoveries. So Wells came as one of the initial and first thinkers who considered that space exploration would be essential for humanity to unite its effort, but also to prevent, as he thought, any potential invasion from space. And Wells, in 1936, was very heavily involved in the production of a film titled Things to Come, based on his film script. He went to Hollywood for that purpose, and in Hollywood, he collaborated with Alexander Korda, becoming very heavily involved in that film production. Towards the end of the film, the viewer sees the space gun, as you see in the image here, firing a rocket into space. The film is open-ended. We do not know what happens next, whether those who are on board that spacecraft will ever come into contact with extraterrestrial forces, or whether indeed they will return to Earth. And yet, coming back to space exploration historically, Wells was some 20 years ahead of his time, because space exploration began in earnest in 1957, following the successful launch of a satellite, Sputnik 1, as it came to be known. Number 8, Wikipedia. You might be surprised. Wikipedia was Wells's prediction, and I believe Wells would have been thrilled to see how we navigate Wikipedia with ease, especially as we query information for initial research. Of course, there would be doubts and caveats as to the more scientific uses of Wikipedia, and yet it remains quite accurate on many counts. So Wells, in the 1930s, he started a campaign for a world encyclopedia. And that campaign coincided with very disturbing and sad events on the continent of Europe. Europe was preparing for another war, and Wells felt that in order to somehow avoid that war, a world encyclopedia would be necessary as a clearinghouse of misunderstanding. A misunderstanding where people would be led by ideologues, by political fanatics, to believe in things like race and ethnicity and divisions and so on. So Wells envisaged this encyclopedia to be universal and available to anyone around the world, to overcome divisions, to overcome lack of knowledge, to overcome a lacking understanding of common history. Wikipedia was established in 2001, so it's quite recent. It's only 20 years old, and yet most of us would be unable to imagine our own present, not so much the future, without Wikipedia. And Wikipedia describes itself pretty much in the spirit of H.G. Wells. It says of itself that it is a free, multilingual, open, collaborative, online encyclopedia. It is a democratic phenomenon, so much that Wells, as I said above, would have been thrilled to see it. It's democratic because it's double-edged in the sense that not only writers of Wikipedia can contribute to it, but also readers of Wikipedia can make corrections, can add information, and also modify articles if there is such need. So it is democratic, it's always growing, and it's available in so many languages. Number 9, and the last prediction that Wells I would like to cover in this lecture, is the singularity. The singularity is a more recent term, of course, than H.G. Wells could have imagined. And yet, in his Men Like Gods, written in 1923, he describes a new race of people. They are human, but they are already post-human. You know, we frequently nowadays operate with these terms, human and post-human. So they are human because we, as readers, do not see how they have arrived where they are. So we see them as humans, as outward evils, but at the same time we realize that they are so much different. In what sense? And primarily they are different because they don't need to use language anymore. And they don't need to go to libraries or for knowledge. Instead, their brains have become wired to a global superintelligence, to the world brain. And so they derive any insight from there. Of course, they need to work in order to gain more and more from the world brain, and yet that superintelligence has become established. And also, they do not use language in any conventional sense of the word we use it. They don't spend so much effort articulating words or learning a new language, just because they now use telepathy. They communicate with the help of brain waves. And so Wells, again, was so much ahead of his time, even of our time, when he projected such possibilities. Because here it's not accidental that I'm displaying the cover of Ray Kurzweil's bestseller, The Singularity is Near. Ray Kurzweil, many of you might know, was the inventor of a text recognition technology, what we know nowadays as the scanner. Quite groundbreaking technology, again, without which our present would be unimaginable. And so he developed his idea of the singularity in that book in 2005. And by the singularity, he meant something very specific. He meant the unity of biological and artificial intelligence. So much that the human brain and the human body will be wired to, I don't know, other machines, other brains, other programs that would allow humans to reprogram their blood, to change the way in which their brain waves occur. And in this way, that would allow humans to live so much longer, to cure disease, and be a bit more united than we are. I mean, for some, of course, those possibilities would look like nightmares. Indeed, yes. But for most, they are still exciting possibilities of where humanity has not yet been. And this takes us further to Wells's oversight. What I mean by oversight is where Wells and his contemporaries overlooked certain things where they got the future wrong. So even though Wells imagined the future accurately on many occasions, neither he nor his contemporaries were able to predict the internet, something without which we cannot live today, and something which is so amazing that we take the waves from the air and all that information comes from nowhere. You don't even need to have a cable today to get access to the internet. So in the 30s, neither Wells nor his contemporaries could think, first of all, of the digital processor, this material object that would enable the existence of the internet. For Wells, the World Encyclopedia was to be comprised of books. So in that sense, Wells was somewhat old-fashioned, antiquated. There would be books, and those books, in order to save storage space, they would be recorded on microfilm, which I display in the image on the left. Unlike the internet, this encyclopedia would provide content. You see, it would provide knowledge. It would also provide an infrastructure, because any user of that knowledge would be able to request microfilm from anywhere in the world, and because there would be, according to Wells, very fast communications, you would get that delivered to your desk as soon as possible. But Wells and his contemporaries failed to envisage all the virtual connections our world has learned to exist in. And yet, it's important to remember that despite the fact that Wells could not predict the internet, does not make his predictions less insightful. Because as we see, they are very courageous, they are brave, they are much ahead of their own time. And because there is this gap in Wells's imagination, the gap of the internet, I would say, of the computer, that shows that the future is far more complex than anyone could ever predict. The future is an open-ended system. Present-day scientists would use horizon scanning to predict the future. But even they today will tell you, will instruct you clearly, that any scanner has its own blind spots. Like any machine, it would have a space or place on which the projection of the future is non-existent, is blind. So that the existence of those blind spots in Wells's imagination is something more universal and to be praised for, again, for the ambition even to think ahead of the future and not to be afraid of it. What is the relevance of Wells in our 21st century? We are drawing to the conclusion. In our time, unfortunately, popular culture tends to imagine the future in rather bleak and pessimistic terms. You see here in the images some of the prophetic examples from the Hunger Games, as it were, where in that series we are presented with characters and heroes who, in order to survive, must give up on any connection with either rivalry with their competitors or their friends. And whether this is the example of the future we want to inhabit is a big question. Then flooding and the nuclear winter are another two examples of common scenarios, how our planet might end. So we are largely exposed to nightmares, global cataclysms, wars, disorder, and suffering. We see how all life on Earth may end in an apocalypse, be it a flood or a nuclear explosion or complete self-destruction. Apparently, the future we would want to inhabit is very difficult to imagine. Coming back to Wells, he was aware of the fulfillment of some of his predictions in his lifetime. He also knew very well that some of his warnings had been ignored. And therefore, half ironically and half seriously, in 1941, he proposed that his tombstone should bear an epitaph. "I told you so, you damned fools." I would not like to end this lecture on this tone. Rather, I would say that Wells's imagination of the future acquires and retains a new importance in our times, precisely because our times seem to be struggling to imagine the future we would want to live in. So Wells's predictions are both promises and warnings, and therefore we should value them as such. As promises, they dare to look beyond nightmares and the pessimism of their own time and our time, where pessimism is a dominant sense that, yes, we are all doomed and are going to destruction. And as warnings, they demand the unity of humanity in the face of the future. Those of you who are interested to find out more on the topic of this lecture, may turn to an article I published last year under the title The Singularity and H.G. Wells's Conception of the Future. I'm giving here the link to that publication, as well as the screenshot of its initial page. And this is where I would like to rest my case. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for coming. And hopefully we'll now open up the floor for discussion.
Okay, Maxim, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. And now we have time for questions. Teraz mamy pytania, czas na pytania do prelegenta. Zapraszamy do dyskusji. Okej, to dziękujemy bardzo za obecność i zapraszamy do odsłuchania ewentualnie ponownego.